Welcome back, everybody, for another deep dive. This time, we're going to be looking at something that I think is super fascinating, and that is bilingualism.
Oh,
So we're talking about how speaking two languages, right, affects your brain, and also how it affects your thinking.
yeah.
So to get into this, we're going to be looking at some research from Judith of Kroll and Ellen Bialystok, who literally wrote a book on this
Oh, wow.
called Understanding the Consequences of Bilingualism for Language Processing and Cognition.
Okay.
So we're going to be pulling from that today. And I think one of the biggest takeaways, at least to start off here, is that both of your languages are always active in your brain, even when you're only using one.
That's right. Yeah. You
Yeah.
don't like just switch one off. They're both sort of humming along in the background all the time.
Really?
Yeah.
So, like, if I'm speaking English to, like, my friends, and I haven't spoken Spanish in a few days, my brain is still, like, processing Spanish.
Yeah, exactly. You can kind of think of it like a computer with multiple programs running. Like you might be focused on one window, but the others are still active in the background.
That's really wild. So if both languages are always on, then why don't bilingual people constantly mix them up?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the research actually shows that highly proficient bilinguals rarely make the error of using the wrong language.
Yeah.
And so it seems like they have this kind of remarkable ability to select the correct language for the situation, even though both of them are vying for attention.
Oh, wow. So there's like a little mental traffic cop in their brain that's like directing the flow of language and making sure the right one comes through.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. And researchers have actually pinpointed a specific area of the brain that seems to be key for this language control system. It's called the anterior cingulate cortex, and it's like the command center for managing attention and making decisions.
Okay, so it's basically the bilingual brain has like a supercharged like control center because they're constantly juggling two languages.
That's the idea. And this constant need to manage two languages might actually give bilinguals what researchers call a bilingual advantage in terms of their cognitive skills.
Okay, I have heard this, that like bilingual people are better at multitasking and like focusing and things like that. Is there any truth to that?
Yeah, there's definitely some truth to that. Studies have shown that bilinguals tend to outperform monolinguals on tasks that require something called executive function.
Hmm.
And these are basically the mental processes that help us to control our attention, switch between tasks, and make decisions.
So like if I'm trying to like ignore the distraction and focus on a specific task, being bilingual might actually help me to do that better.
Exactly. And one classic example of this is something called the Simon task, where you basically have to press a key that corresponds to the color of a shape on the screen.
Hmm.
Bilinguals consistently perform better on this task,
Yeah.
even in conditions where there's no conflicting information to distract them.
Oh, wow.
So it's not just about being faster. It seems like they have better control over their attention and their responses.
So we've kind of established here that like bilingual brains are these like multitasking marvels, right?
Yeah.
But I'm curious about how this like constant juggling act actually plays out in the brain itself.
All
Like,
right.
do we know anything about the specific changes that occur?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's something that researchers are still, actively exploring. But one of the fascinating findings is that bilingualism actually seems to increase the density of gray matter
Oh, wow.
in certain areas of the brain, including that anterior cingulate cortex that we were just talking about.
Wait, so my brain is actually physically like getting bigger and denser because I speak two languages.
That's what the research suggests, yeah.
That's crazy.
And it's not just about size either. Bilingualism also seems to enhance the connections between different brain areas, so it kind of improves the communication and efficiency.
So it's like upgrading your brain's infrastructure, like better roads, faster connections, smoother traffic flow.
Exactly, yeah. And this enhanced brain connectivity may be one of the reasons why bilinguals show these advantages in tasks that require mental flexibility and cognitive control.
Okay, so you keep saying mental flexibility.
Right.
What exactly does that mean, and how does that relate to bilingualism?
Well, it's a concept that was actually first proposed by researchers Peel and Lambert way back in 1962.
Wow.
But it's becoming increasingly relevant again as we learn more about the complexities of bilingualism. And essentially, mental flexibility refers to the brain's ability to adapt to new situations, shift between tasks, and see things from multiple perspectives.
So basically, like bilinguals are mental gymnasts, just like slipping between languages and thought processes with ease.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And the more we study bilingualism, the more we realize that It's not just about knowing two languages. It's really about having a brain that's wired for adaptability and cognitive flexibility.
Okay. So all this is really fascinating. I have to admit, I'm still a little bit fuzzy on how this mental flexibility actually plays out in, like, real life.
Right.
Like, can you give me some concrete examples?
Sure. So imagine you're planning a trip.
Okay.
A bilingual person might be more adept at considering multiple options, weighing the pros and cons, and adapting their plans as new information arises. Or, think about problem solving at work. A bilingual person might be better at brainstorming creative solutions, seeing things from different angles, and coming up with more innovative approaches.
So it's not just like, you're a better language learner. It makes you like a more flexible and adaptable thinker in like all areas of your life.
Yeah, that's exactly what the research suggests. And the benefits seem to extend throughout the lifespan, from childhood development all the way to cognitive aging.
Wow, this is really making me rethink everything I thought I knew about language.
Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about how bilingualism affects the brain as a whole, but what about the specific processes of like understanding and producing language?
Right.
Like, do we see the same kind of bilingual advantage in those areas as well?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. It really leads us into a deeper exploration of how bilingualism shapes language processing itself. So let's dive into that next.
When we think about language processing, it's kind of easy to get caught up in the idea of words as individual units, like building blocks. But there's so much more going on beneath the surface, especially when we're talking about bilingual.
Right. So it's not just like they have two separate dictionaries in their heads, one for each language.
Exactly. Even at the level of single words, research shows that both languages are kind of active simultaneously, even if you're only using one.
Wow.
So it's like both dictionaries are open and your brain's kind of cross-referencing between them. I'm really starting to see how this all ties back into that idea of mental flexibility.
Right.
Like your brain's just constantly making connections, even at like the most basic level of language.
That's right. And this simultaneous activation has been demonstrated in numerous studies using eye tracking and, brainwave measurements.
Oh, wow.
So, for example, when bilinguals read a word in one language, their brains show evidence of briefly accessing related words in their other language, even if they're not consciously aware of it.
So my brain's doing all this extra work without me even, like, realizing it.
Yeah,
it's almost like a hidden superpower.
I like the way you put that, and these effects aren't limited to reading either.
Oh.
Even when bilinguals plan to speak in one language, research shows that their other language is still active and can actually influence how they formulate their thoughts.
It makes you wonder, how did they keep everything straight?
Yeah.
And I guess that's where this like superior mental control comes in.
Exactly. And it's not just about individual words either. Bilingualism also has these really fascinating implications for how we process grammar.
Okay.
You might assume that each language has its own set of grammatical rules, kind of neatly tucked away in separate compartments of the brain.
Right, like each one has its own like instruction manual or something.
Exactly. But it turns out it's not that simple. Research suggests that the grammars of a bilingual's languages can actually influence each other, even at a subconscious level.
So even the like rule books are getting mixed up a little bit.
In a way, yes. There's evidence that experience with one language can actually shape how you process grammar in your other language, even if those languages have very different structures.
Okay. Do you have like an example of what that looks like?
Absolutely. One study looked at Spanish-English bilinguals living in the U.S., and it focused on how they process sentences with relative clauses.
Relative clauses.
In Spanish, their native language.
Okay.
So relative clauses.
I feel like I've learned about this in school. Can you remind me what those are?
Sure. So they're basically clauses that provide additional information about a noun in a sentence.
Okay.
So, for example, in the sentence, the book that I read was fascinating.
Okay.
The clause that I read is a relative clause that's modifying the noun book.
Ah, okay. I remember those.
Yeah.
So how did bilingualism affect how these people process relative clauses?
Well, Spanish and English actually have different preferences for how these relative clauses attach to nouns in a sentence.
Okay.
So English speakers tend to attach them to the noun that's closest to the clause. Whereas Spanish speakers tend to attach them higher up in the sentence structure.
So it's like each language has like a different default setting for how to interpret these grammatical relationships.
Exactly. And what's fascinating is that the Spanish-English bilinguals in this study, despite being native Spanish speakers, they actually showed parsing preferences that were more similar to English speakers.
Oh, wow.
And the longer they'd been immersed in English, the stronger this effect became.
That's so interesting.
It was as if, like, their experience with English grammar was subtly reshaping how they process Spanish.
So even though they were reading in Spanish, like, their English was influencing how their brains made sense of the sentence.
Exactly, and it really highlights this fact that bilingualism isn't just about, adding a second language on top to your first. It's really about this kind of fundamental reorganization of your cognitive systems.
Right.
That's affecting everything from attention and control to the very way you process language at its core.
Yeah, this is making me realize just how complex and like dynamic the bilingual brain truly is.
Right.
It's constantly adapting and evolving based on the languages it's exposed to.
That's right. And it really challenges us to move beyond these kind of simplistic notions of language as this fixed set of rules. Bilingualism really shows us that language is this fluid and dynamic system that's shaped by experience and constantly interacting with other cognitive processes.
So this is all like super fascinating. But I have to ask, like, are there any downsides to this like constant mental juggling act?
Yeah.
Like, do bilinguals ever struggle with things that monolinguals find easy?
That's a common question.
Yeah.
It's an important one to address.
Yeah.
So while bilinguals often excel in tasks that require, cognitive control, there are some instances where they might show slightly slower processing speeds in certain language tasks.
So are you saying that all this mental flexibility, it comes at a cost?
Not necessarily. The research on this is actually quite nuanced.
Okay.
So, for example, when it comes to retrieving words from their mental lexicon, bilinguals might sometimes take, a fraction of a second longer to, like, name a picture or translate a word compared to monolinguals.
So all those extra connections in their brains are actually, like, slowing them down sometimes?
Well, you think about it this way. Imagine you have this huge library, right?
Okay.
With books in 2 languages.
Yeah.
So it might take you a little bit longer to find a specific book because you have more options to sift through. But the overall richness and depth of your library is far greater.
That's a great analogy.
Right. So while bilinguals might experience these like occasional tip-of-the-tongue moments or slight delays in word retrieval, they ultimately have access to this much larger and more diverse vocabulary.
Okay, so to kind of wrap all this up, we've covered a lot of ground here, like this constant co-activation of languages,
Right.
cognitive benefits, the impact on grammar, and even changes in the brain itself.
Yeah.
It's clear that like being bilingual is much more than just knowing 2 languages.
Right.
It's like a whole different way of thinking and processing the world around us.
Absolutely. And the research in this field is like constantly evolving with new discoveries being made all the time. And what's particularly exciting is the potential for this research to shed light on, broader questions about language learning, cognitive development, and even how we can maintain like mental sharpness as we age.
Speaking of new discoveries, there's one more area I want to kind of delve into that I found particularly intriguing.
Okay.
And it has to do with how bilinguals manage to switch between languages so effortlessly,
Right.
sometimes even within the same sentence.
Yeah.
I'm talking about code switching.
Code switching.
I know.
It's fascinating.
Yeah, it is.
It really highlights the incredible flexibility of the bilingual brain.
Right. So let's explore that in the final part of our deep dive. Okay, so let's talk about code switching. I have some friends who do this, and it's always so impressive how smoothly they can go back and forth between languages, sometimes even in the same sentence. It's really wild.
Yeah, it really is quite a skill. And it just highlights how dynamic that bilingual brain is.
Yeah, I've always wondered if there are like specific rules for code switching or if it's just kind of a free-for-all.
Well, it's definitely not random. There are definitely patterns and social rules that kind of govern how and when bilinguals code switch. But those rules can be pretty complex, and they can vary depending on the languages involved, the social context, even the relationship between the speakers.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So like what's actually happening in the brain when someone code switches? Are they like mentally like flipping a switch between their 2 languages?
It's a little more nuanced than that. Remember how we talked about both languages always being active in a bilingual's brain?
Right, the always on phenomenon.
Yeah, exactly. So during code switching, it seems that the brain is like constantly adjusting the activation levels of both languages, kind of allowing elements of each one to come to the forefront at different points in the conversation. So instead of a hard switch, it's more like a dimmer switch. with the brain kind of seamlessly fading in and out different aspects of each language.
That's a really good way to visualize it. So it's not about switching languages entirely. It's about like finding this way to kind of blend them seamlessly in a way that makes sense for the situation.
Exactly. And just like a good DJ needs to have a feel for the music and the audience.
Yeah.
A skilled code switcher really needs to be attuned to both the linguistic and the social nuances of the situation.
Yeah, it really does sound like code switching requires like a really high level of cognitive control and flexibility.
It definitely does. And some researchers even believe that this constant mental juggling act might actually have cognitive benefits, beyond the typical bilingual advantage we've already talked about.
Really? Like what?
Well, some studies suggest that code switching could actually enhance creativity, problem-solving skills, and even perspective-taking abilities.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Like, if you're constantly having to, like, consider multiple ways of expressing yourself and kind of navigating, like, all these different linguistic systems, it's like your brain's just getting this constant workout in flexibility and adaptability.
Exactly. It's like cross-training for your brain. Code switching really forces you to think outside the box of a single language system and find new and creative ways to communicate your ideas.
This whole deep dive has been incredibly eye-opening. I'm starting to see bilingualism in a whole new light. It's not just about knowing two languages. It's about having a brain that's wired for flexibility, adaptability, and just a deeper understanding of the nuances of language and communication.
Yeah, I think you put that really well, and it really underscores just how much we still have to learn about, the incredible power of language to shape how we think and perceive the world. And bilingualism really offers this fascinating window into the complexity and plasticity of the human brain.
Yeah, I have to admit, I'm kind of in awe of bilinguals now. They're not just like language whizzes. They're like cognitive superheroes.
I think there's some truth to that, and for you, dear listener, we hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity about the amazing world of bilingualism and its really profound impact on the human mind.